U.S. support for Israel has long been a hot-button topic in U.S. foreign policy. However, this controversy remained relatively dormant in recent years as the U.S. wound down its operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and attention turned back to Europe and Asia. That said, it's jumped right back into the headlines after the October 7th attacks, and it's become even more polarizing and divisive than ever before. Still, America largely supports Israel, but is this stance beginning to change? What has changed and why is that change happening? What solution to this conflict do Americans see? Well, this video is going to have a lot of data on this, so I hope you're ready to go. Gallup has run several polls on this since the war began and even before the war. Most Americans held a favorable view of Israel in the years before the war, the lowest point being in the 1980s and 90s with a 45% approval rating as the floor. Since then and throughout this century, Israel's approval rating has remained above 50%. Since the October 7th attacks happened, Americans again mostly rallied around Israel. However, it was not unanimous. Even days after the attack, many Americans' disapproval of Israel began to climb, and that's largely broken down along party lines and more specifically along generational lines. A major driver of Israel's disapproval rating has been their military conduct. Republicans remain largely supportive of Israel with a 71% approval rating in March of 2023. Democrats and independents were largely disapproving of Israel already by November. Republicans remain largely supportive of Israel with 71% approval rating back in March. Democrats and independents were largely disapproving of Israel already by November, with 48% of independents and 63% of Democrats disapproving of Israel's conduct in Gaza. As the war in Gaza has dragged on, disapproval of Israel has continued to increase, again with their military conduct being a main driver here. Republican approval fell by 64% to March of 2024, with only 29% of independents and 18% of Democrats approving their actions. Like I said, this is also very much split along generational lines. In 2023, Israel remained largely favorable across the board. 64% of those 18 to 34 years old supported Israel, with 66% of those 35 to 54 years old, and a whopping 74% of those 55 and up supporting Israel. However, in 2024, those numbers have all dropped, with the most significant drops occurring amongst younger people. Support from those 18 to 34 fell from 64% approval to 38%, with support from those 35 to 54 falling from 66 to 55%, and support from those 55 and up maintaining but still falling down to 71%. All of this coincides with the growing disapproval of Benjamin Netanyahu even inside of Israel, but especially among Americans. While he had kept a favorable opinion throughout the 2000s, disapproval has now spiked with a peak at 47% disapproval in December 2023 and a current 45% disapproval rating in 2024. Only 33% approved of him in 2023, with 35% approving in 2024. This also follows a rising disapproval among Israelis of Netanyahu. Predictably, even this is split along party lines and is also becoming increasingly polarized. Republicans still favor Netanyahu with a 66% approval rating from Republicans in 2024 and a 30% approval rating from independents and only 12% approval from Democrats. The disconnect could not have been more visible during Netanyahu's visit to DC, where he addressed Congress. In fact, this was a near perfect example of these polls coming to life. While Netanyahu addressed Congress with Republicans largely applauding and supporting him, Democrats remained silent and even reacted negatively to his speech. While just outside the Capitol at Union Station, young people protested, going as far as burning the American flags and raising Palestinian flags above Union Station. Still though, Americans are largely split on how exactly the United States should handle this conflict, even though they do agree that this conflict is important. Throughout the 2000s, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has largely been viewed as either critical or at least important to U.S. vital interests, with the critical percentage actually falling below the important percentage throughout the late teens and early 20s, before spiking again before the October 7th attacks. Regardless, most Americans are still at a complete loss for what a good solution to this conflict actually is. The majority of Americans want to see some sort of ceasefire. However, the real question is what form that ceasefire should take and who should be compelled to give up a bit of their position to allow for a ceasefire, as well as what actually should follow a ceasefire. 39% of Americans believe the Palestinians should be pressured, with 36% of Americans believing the Israelis should be pressured more. 50% of Americans believe a two-state solution was possible before the war in February of 2023. 2023, but that has now fallen to just 42% in 2024. So Americans are largely split on this conflict, and this split is largely along partisan or generational lines, but they are all completely split on how exactly this conflict should be resolved. And that is a great place for us to be in. There's optimism among Democrats and independents that the election may bring some change to the U.S. position on Israel, as President Biden has maintained U.S. aid for Israel. However, there is a general misunderstanding about what this aid actually is and what it doesn't do. Biden has enforced limits to this aid, like when he halted offensive aid following Israel's move into Rafah. Defensive aid, like the Iron Dome interceptors and other types of defensive equipment, has continued, but that's just there to stop incoming rockets from Hamas and Hezbollah. Should Trump take office, that aid likely will come without limits. However, we've seen Trump also enforce limits on U.S. allies in the past, and there's the possibility that, given information that he doesn't currently have, as he's not the acting president or the member of government, he might alter his position once he enters office and should he win. The optimism is instead on what Kamala Harris does, should she win the election, whether she should impose stricter restrictions on U.S. aid and increase pressure on Israel. However, as we've seen the division among Americans about this conflict, it's unclear how impactful this will be towards who actually wins the election, as it's not a significant or even central piece of this election. It is, however, probably the most immediate and divisive foreign policy issue that either candidate has to come up with an answer for. This picture gets even more complicated when expanding the scope to include Iran. As tensions in the Middle East have expanded to potentially include a wider regional war, Americans are increasingly concerned about a war with Iran. A recent poll showed that 55% of Americans are not in favor of sending troops to fight Iran. Should the war in Gaza expand to include fighting in Lebanon or even beyond, there doesn't appear to be significant political will to actually sustain the fight with ground troops. Of course, the US already has had ground troops in Iraq and Syria, with troops in Iraq for over 20 years and troops in Syria for about 5. And the Pentagon released a statement recently saying that the US has around 40,000 troops in the Middle East right now. That said, this presence of troops that we have in the Middle East is something that most Americans seem to have forgotten about. While they're there to help with fighting ISIS and other terrorist groups, they've also become targets for the Iranian axis of resistance. And this puts the United States in a very challenging position. US personnel have been injured in these attacks, and each time it begs the question, why are they still there? Does the stationing of troops in these high-risk areas that aren't likely to stabilize anytime soon actually help US security? Or does it threaten US security by putting a target on US troops and increasing distrust of the United States and its intentions among Arab countries? Overall, this is a deeply complicated and controversial subject within the United States. It touches communities that are American but tie their roots to this conflict. And the US support for Israel means that it's not a neutral party. However, there's still a lot of misunderstanding about the support that I think impacts the polling data that we've discussed. For instance, there are dueling narratives about the US involvement in the conflict. The first being that the US supports genocide. The US has halted offensive weapon deliveries to Israel following the devastating Israeli air campaign in Gaza that's killed tens of thousands of civilians. They've also increased pressure on Israel to agree to a ceasefire, as well as dropping humanitarian aid and attempting to establish a temporary port in Gaza. The port was a complete disaster, but that had nothing to do with the policy. The policy intention was for it to work. It just logistically didn't really work out. If the US truly supported a genocide, then I would be absolutely shocked if we would actually continue with humanitarian aid and increasing pressure on the Israeli government to reach a ceasefire agreement. That said, there's a second narrative from the other side of the conflict. That is that the US isn't doing enough to defend Israel and supports terrorists. The withholding of offensive aid has been used as an argument that the US is leaving Israel high and dry in the moment that they need it the most. Never mind the fact that they never stopped defensive aid, like Iron Dome interceptors and other types of defensive weaponry, which is what actually keeps Israeli citizens safe. And also never mind the fact that that offensive aid ban was lifted as things began to heat up between Israel and Hezbollah, and the threat of a broader war began to rise. In either case, the United States is very much stuck in the middle of an information war that not only hits the United States, but is very much in the Middle East. Both sides think the US isn't doing enough to help them, and that they're secretly supporting their enemy. This is not just an information war that's made it into the election, it's made it into the cultural conversation in the United States. It's not something that will go away quickly and easily, and in fact it'll only get worse the longer the US goes without a competent strategy to counter these narratives and really shine a truth on the issue. The pinch there is that the US has a very thin area that it can operate information-wise because it is taking such a measured approach. It supports Israel, but it does not support genocide. It wants things to improve in Gaza and for Palestinians to be protected, but it does not want Hamas to survive the war, and Hamas remains the dominant political force within the Gaza Strip. It wants Israel to defend itself, but it doesn't want Israel to start a broader regional conflict or to let the war in Gaza become a protracted conflict. Nor does the United States want Israel to harm innocent people along the way. It's a complicated debate, and as you can see, Americans on opposite ends really don't understand what to do about it. But it certainly has been a major source of controversy in the United States. So with all that, I want to hear your thoughts on this conflict. Let's keep it nice in the comments, but I want to hear your actual thoughts on what's going on and really kind of what the polls that we've talked about here say about this conflict. So let me know down in the comments. Like this video to help it reach new audiences and really enliven the conversation down in the comments, and subscribe for more videos just like this one. With all that, I'll see y'all next time. Later.